Pepper day called for a drink. It's today.
Yeah, I know.
Yes, absolutely.
It's just
Okay. All right. So I just shared with you guys the live stream link, and I'm going to go tweet that right now so people can.
okay.
All righty.
Okay.
Did that right.
Well, let's hope it works. We're trying things here. So this is it's a bunch of historians working with technology. I mean, what could go wrong, right? So yes, indeed. So we're still having some people join us, so we'll give it maybe like 30 more seconds so everybody can refill their drinks for our evening happy hour here.
Okay.
All right. Hang on, almost there.
Yep, no problem. We got a minute or two. I'm gonna actually start the recording. So that's good. I think our live stream has begun.
There we go.
All right. All right. So we all set? Want to get going? All right. Great. Thank you, guys. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. My name is Matt Gabriel. I'm a professor at Virginia Tech, and I'm a historian. I'm the chair of the Department of Religion and Culture here. I'm a medievalist. And thank you very much for trying out this experiment with us. This was a wonderful idea that Varsha and I kind of were talking about and coming up with. Just a way of getting historians together, of having kind of drunk history, but with maybe a little bit less drunk and more history kind of than you might see in the drunk history thing. We'll see how things go, I guess. As somebody pointed out to me yesterday, a lot of drinking can happen in 30 minutes. So
Exactly.
It sounds like a challenge to me.
It does indeed sound like a challenge. So this is also, one of the ideas behind it was not only to kind of get together with some friends virtually and talk about some things that we might not ordinarily be able to talk about, but also to raise awareness for some various charities. And so as we pointed out both on Twitter, and you'll get an email if you're here now afterwards, is that we encourage you, if you can, absolutely, is to donate to Feeding America, which is a network of food banks for to serve people who are hungry during the time of COVID-19, but also the Minnesota Freedom Fund to help activists who are fighting racist violence and racist oppression in Minnesota right now. So, and remember too, this is going to be a weekly thing, so we'll talk a little bit about what's happening next week at the end there. So again, let me turn it over to my colleague and co-host, Varsha, and she can introduce herself.
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Varsha. I'm a grad student at Berkeley. I study US history, mainly foreign policy and infrastructure. And I, just like that, I had this idea mainly because I was getting tired of just talking to people over Twitter. So I thought, why don't we just try to talk to people as close to in person as we can. Also, we should all drink. So talking about drinking, we have Professor Kruse, Kevin, here today. Kevin, how'd you choose your drink tonight?
I'm a Southerner, so by law, I'm required to drink bourbon. This is an old family cocktail recipe. It's called bourbon with one ice cube. And for people at home, grab a pen. You'll want to write this down. What you do is you put one large ice cube in a cocktail tumbler, and then you put about 3 fingers of bourbon in it, and then you enjoy.
Yeah.
Or more, right? I mean, you can do more than 3 fingers, right?
I don't want to.
Yeah.
Whatever you feel like.
we're historians. We're not about rules here, right?
No,
it's just about like,
break with the
just
past.
doing what we want. Absolutely.
I found that bourbon for me is more of a summer drink. And so bourbon with ice, that's the best cocktail for this intense California heat. So yeah, I'm having Blanton's myself. Blanton's is a bourbon as well. And when I finish that, I'll probably have another bourbon. Kevin, what are you drinking? Not Kevin, Matt, what are you drinking?
I'm drinking Larceny bourbon. I felt like we should keep with the theme. So and I'm more than happy to do that. You know, as I was mentioning to some of you guys earlier, is that I decided when I moved to the South, I came from Berkeley when I did my PhD and moved to Virginia. I decided like I needed to understand what this whole bourbon thing was. And growing up as an undergraduate, when I first started to, before I was of age, honestly, drink alcohol, I thought that bourbon was really terrible, but it turns out bourbon's really delicious, actually, if you buy the right ones. So
yeah, if you buy the right ones, it's like you're drinking vanilla and alcohol and like caramel and nuts. It's such an amazing concoction, truly.
It's an amazing concoction. So yes.
Yeah.
So I guess, I mean, since we've talked a little bit about alcohol, we should talk about history too, if that's all right, Kevin, if you're okay with that. So Little, I guess, yeah. I mean, you know, just it's hard to bring work home with you, I guess. But, I know. Since we're working at home, you're still working anyway.
That's all we're doing.
So that's what we're doing, right? So can you tell us, like, what gets you excited about studying the past? I mean, do you have like a favorite course to teach? I mean, like, why did you get interested in? I mean, you're an American historian. Like, what kind of excited you to pursue this and to do this as kind of your work?
Yeah. That's a great question. I've always been fascinated by American political history, which is odd given that when I started out, you know, I was an undergrad at UNC in 1990, when the bottom had really fallen out of American political history. It was not a big field. It wasn't something people were doing. Luckily, though, one of my undergrad advisors was Bill Lechtenberg, who's like the dean of the New Deal historians, and taking this class made it really come alive for me. And I kind of quickly got into political history as a way to answer questions about the present, right? I mean, it seems like an obvious thing to do for an historian, but I really was animated by trying to figure out problems that were around me. And that's really driven a lot of my work. My first book was really an effort to understand where white Southerners fit in the civil rights struggle, and you know, a part that hadn't really been written about at that point. And my second book was I came up with in the middle of the Bush administration, trying to figure out what was going on with the religious rights and the claims they were making. And so it really has always been kind of questions about the present have fueled my interest in the past, really.
Yeah. No, I think that's really common. I mean, even as a medievalist, right? I remember very distinctly, I was in graduate school when 9/11 happened, for example, and then there were all these kind of precursor hot takes. We didn't know to call them hot takes at the time, right? But hot takes about kind of analogies to the Crusades. And I ended up deciding, like, I need to know something about this. Like, this is really what kind of got me interested in that. So is that the same for you, kind of, Varsha?
Yeah, I studied dams, and the way I got into dams was I took a class on the history of development, and I read a piece by Lilienthal, who heads the TVA, and the way he was talking about India, Pakistan was very reminiscent of exactly what was going on at the time in India and Pakistan, and this conflict over water. And so the reason I study water and dams is very much attempting to understand the present and how we got to where we are today, especially considering the level of dam failures we see in the United States. I was just reading up on what happened in Michigan recently. And so understanding the present is really, really a big part of why people and why I study water history and why I study dams. I think it's essential to have some sort of a foot in the present to sort of ground yourself into why you're studying this type of history.
Yeah. No, and I think you bring up a really great point too. And if I could throw this back to Kevin, is the importance of kind of a great teacher, right? Somebody bringing up a topic to you that you've never kind of encountered before. So, I mean, Kevin, you kind of mentioned this, in your response as well, but like when you're teaching, like do you have a favorite course that you kind of teach at Princeton now?
Yeah, I mean, I teach a variety of different courses, and so my bread and butter course is my big lecture course, which is it's an awkward set of dates. It's 1920 to 1974. which I don't think anyone else in the world teaches.
Okay.
But I like it. It's mid 20th century U.S. history, and so I get to teach, from the 20s and the Depression of a New Deal, World War II, the 50s, the Civil Rights struggle, the 60s, on up through Watergate. That's a lot of fun. But my favorite one is actually a course that I took over. It was built up ages ago by Dan Rogers and Sean Malentz. It's got a boring name. It's called Approaches to American History, but it's not an historiography course.
Okay.
It's actually a course in which we every month we do a deep dive onto a particular topic. So 3 topics, and they rotate by the offering. But the last time I did it, it was the Little Rock desegregation crisis, the Dawes Act and Native American policy, and the Salem witch trials. And so we just spent a month on these topics, and it's the exact opposite of a lecture course in which I maybe give 1 lecture or 2 lectures of the semester, and instead the students are given this pack of primary documents like a phone book, and they have to slowly work their way through it. So it's a real delight. I'm an archive rat. It's a real delight to get to watch undergrads kind of experience that for the first time. It's in a kind of a carefully managed way. They're all sophomores, but they're all usually very bright. Kind of as a self-selecting group who takes this course, and it's just really a lot of fun to kind of watch them puzzle through documents, at the same pace we would. It's great.
Yeah, the first 2 classes I ever took in undergrad were the first half of the U.S. survey with Brian DeLay and the second half of the U.S. survey with Robin Einhorn. And so the way they teach the class is very different from what anyone would expect. So much so that I think back in like 2008 or something, Rick Santorum claimed that Berkeley doesn't teach real history.
Right.
So the way that DeLay teaches it is he spends weeks and weeks on Native Americans and teaches it as like the history of North America. And so you really get into the colonial conflict between the European powers. And the best part about Einhorn's class for the second half of the US survey is all of the reading is just primary sources. You get this giant book of like 500 pages of primary sources. Like you read the whole Red Record from Wells. And so it was like one of the best semesters ever. And then the final paper is you have to go to the Bancroft and find primary sources yourself and try to write a research paper. Right. And so I think that's the best part about taking history in undergrad is if you have a good professor who are willing to like expand your knowledge of not just the normal survey, but how to actually do history. That's how you get people really hooked on it.
There's something absolutely intense, even as a medievalist, like giving them a translated 12th century chronicle and seeing an engineer's eyes light up when you ask him, like, well, what do you think? What do you think is actually going on here? And they're like, what? You want to know what I think? It's like, yeah, like you've read the text. Like, what do you think? What do you think is kind of going on here? And it's really amazing. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, while there is a lot of good history out there, there's also a lot of bad history. So Kevin, what's like the worst movie or book about your research that you've ever seen? And was it a delight or more torture to read it or watch it?
I mean, the worst, if I take my field as mid-20th century US history, the worst movie about that has to be the movie Pearl Harbor, which is
really okay.
By the end of that movie, I was rooting for the Japanese. It was really, but I'm kind of a civil rights and politics historian, and so I'd have to say it's actually a good movie, but it's horrible history. Mississippi Burning.
I was wondering if you were going to say that. Yeah. Okay.
And I love so many people in it. It's got Willem Dafoe and Gene Hackman, and it's fantastic. But it takes the murders of Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, this kind of iconic moment in the civil rights struggle, and it completely gets the history wrong. The FBI are these liberal crusaders who are out to do the right thing, and not, J. Edgar Hoover's, agents down there who really weren't interested in probing this issue. And then the activists are completely written out. The African Americans are totally passive in this story and not doing kind of the heroic work of the Freedom Summer. And then even the good people in the government, I'm writing about John Doerr now in my new project, who actually prosecutes the case, does some great stuff down there. Again, totally sidelined. It's these great FBI agents who are the white saviors who come down and save the day, and it's completely wrong. And again, love Defoe, love Hackman. The movie's well done, but it's horrible history.
Yeah.
So is it, just as a question, like kind of following up, like, is it a useful movie though? Like, do you ever use it to kind of as an entry point? I mean, like, not that, you know, our students necessarily have ever seen that because it's an old movie and it's not on YouTube or anything like that. But like, is it still kind of a useful kind of teaching document, do you think?
I mean, it misrepresents a lot about the South. The one thing it gets right is actually, I think, Stephen Tobolowsky plays basically the head of the Citizens Council. And I thought it does a good job of that one point, which is something that largely gets written out of usual civil rights stories. It's largely, you know, you have the Crusader protagonist, again, usually white Southern, against the obvious racists of the Ku Klux Klan. And it's kind of divided like that. And what I did like about that movie, given that it came out in '88, it's kind of surprising, is that Tobolowsky plays this Citizens Council person, and you can see the respectable white racist who are kind of propping up the power structure. So that part's good. I never use it in teaching, and I use a lot of films, but I usually use films that are bad in a different way. Like, so when I teach Vietnam, I use John Wayne's Green Berets, which I love.
Wow. Okay, yeah.
Because the beauty of Green Berets is that it was basically sponsored by the Johnson administration, right? And it sets up the administration's rationale for Vietnam beautifully. There's a scene early on in the movie where David Johansen, star of The Fugitive, plays a cynical reporter who comes in and is questioning the Green Berets about why are we in Vietnam? And the answers these Green Berets give back are perfect Johnson administration rationales about the international communist conspiracy, global politics, we're helping liberate the Vietnamese people, they're good people fighting for democracy, on and on and on. And it's this nice tight window, and it's like a 4-minute scene that beautifully captures this moment. And I use this in the Vietnam lecture I give as a transition piece between 1965, when the movie starts, and 1968 when it comes out, right? And so it takes 3 long years for this movie to come out. And this thing that had seemed perfectly plausible in 65, by 68, post-Tet, it's just a laughing stock, right? So it shows the way in which those points the administration was trying to make age really badly, really quickly.
Yeah. I mean, follow-up question, do you ever use All the President's Men as in your classes, or is that just more of a fun movie for students?
It's more of a fun movie, yeah. And again, I love All the President's Men, a great movie. The problem with All the President's Men, though, is that it makes Woodward and Bernstein seem to be the end-all and be-all of the investigation, right? You know, John J. Sirica, the judge who cracks open the Watergate burglaries, is nowhere to be seen. The Senate, the House, the Patman Committee, and none of these people are in there. It really is kind of crusading journalists who do it all on their own, and that's it. So no, I don't teach with that one.
Yeah. So I mean, this is another follow-up to like the worst movies. Like, one thing that's happened very recently, I would say, even before the current president was elected, is we see a lot of bad history. You know, shallow analogies, bad history, not just on Twitter, but also on TV, on cable
Twitter,
news.
really? No.
Yeah, yeah.
Can you believe that?
I should look into that. Yeah,
you should look into that. That's right. Like,
besides the retort, you know, Republicans freed the slaves, there's like a lot of just general bad history of people being like, this is the worst it's ever been, and a lot of things. How do we get away from bad history? You know, what can historians do to help? Not just historians who already have a public profile like you, but historians who are teaching all the way from colleges and universities all the way down to high schools. What should we be doing to help?
I mean, there's a lot we can do. One is to push back against these kind of facile takes when we can. And there's a real tendency, as horrible as the world is right now, there's a real tendency to kind of get into hyperbole and claim that this is the worst it's ever been. Again, you know, there was a period in this country's history where half the country was killing the other half of the country. We had a literal civil war, pretty bad. Yes. I know you're medievalist. That might be news to you, man. I'm sorry.
I never heard about this. So
right. Yeah. So we can kind of put it in perspective. This is one of the things I think as an historian we all do, which is that we know really how bad things have been in the past. It helps put a little perspective on the present. I think we can also help fight these one-to-one comparisons. I constantly see people saying, oh, this year is 1918. No, this year is 1929. No, today, this year is 1968. It's never all one of those things. You know, it's like the old fable of the seven blind men and the elephant. They each have part of the elephant that they're touching, and they try to describe the whole thing out of that. It's all of those things together. On Twitter, I call this disaster Voltron is what we're living through. We've got pieces of all those past years. Wait,
the lion Voltron or the space Voltron?
That's important. I'm gonna say lion Voltron, I think.
That's the correct answer because that's the only good Voltron. Thank you. Okay, go ahead.
Didn't realize it could be tested here. But so it's a combination of all those things, right? So we can draw on the past, but I think we need to remind people that it's not a perfect repetition. You know, history doesn't repeat; it rhymes a little.
Yeah.
I think the really
I find this.
Go ahead.
Oh, I just find this really important in like applied history. So there are like departments across the country that are attempting to get historians to work in policy arena, right? And so when you're attempting to use history to work in foreign policy or public policy, you really want to shy away from these like one-to-one analogies, and you want to look at how contingency is more important. And I think, you know, your talk about Mississippi burning and all the president's men makes a good point. Like there's so much of the story that's left out when you attempt to generalize or make an analogy or be didactic about it. And I think that's what, it's a really good point about that. Go on.
And I think a way around that is again, what I try to do when I do a Twitter thread, which is really just to bring the sources, right? So I find, and again, it's how I teach. I teach with primary sources whenever possible. Because I'm often teaching on touchy subjects that people have, they come in with you know, preconceptions about them, right? And they have their own politics they bring to bear. And so it's much easier to leave the jargon aside and the preconceptions if you force them to just look at the actual evidence. I think that's something that we can all do, and a lot of historians on Twitter do, is provide that kind of that primary source material to the public. And we can interpret it, we can put some context for it, but ultimately, I think just getting that material out there, it really does a great deal of good to show that it's not as simplistic as the kind of bumper sticker history a lot of people are offering is. History is much more, it's messy, right? It's about conflict, it's about confusion. And ultimately, I think that ultimately helps people feel a little bit better about their own time when they're feeling confused and conflicted and not quite having a clear sense of things. It's to know that the past was just as messy and muddy as the present is.
I think I love that you made that connection too between kind of the engagement that you do on a much larger scale than either Varsha or I do on Twitter with teaching, right? Is that it's the same kind of engagement, you know, just in a different media. And the fact that, you know, trying to bring to the audience or to the publics that we're talking to, regardless of kind of the medium that we're doing that, the primary sources, and saying like, listen, like, this is here. Like, listen, let's talk about what's here. And there's better ways and worse ways to kind of interpret this. But, you know, we can talk about this and we can participate in the production of knowledge around these things. You know, I think that's a really critical thing that some of our colleagues have kind of shied away from, but I think is really, really useful and interesting and important in this particular moment. So,
yeah.
So I think kind of transitioning there is that, you know, the other thing that we as kind of professional historians, if you do, is not just kind of teaching, but is also kind of the research, which I think is sometimes it's bifurcated in really unhelpful ways, but I think it is interesting to think about it in different senses. Sometimes it's like, do you have a publication that you're particularly proud of, like maybe something that you're working on right now, or something that you published a while ago that really, you know, you really kind of like something just a kernel of something that you were able to put out there in the world that you were really kind of happy about?
You know, your books are like your children. You love them all. You don't have a favorite, but
you do. But you do.
Hang on, my kids are downstairs. You know, I would say my favorite of the ones that are out, I think, would probably still be White Flight. I think your first book is the one you pour your early passion and your interest in. Also, given that you write it as a graduate student, I know graduate students don't feel this way, but you have such less demands on your time that you can just focus entirely on that project. I had 2 years in Atlanta that was all I was doing, right? I mean, professionally, but also personally. I was still, I was 26 and single. I could just work on that. And so I kind of poured my heart into that project. And for me, White Flight has really been interesting because it came out and it was received well, visited, because, I talk about some of the early, I talk about the first neo-Nazi movement in the country. I talk about the Klan and white supremacy, things that have come resurging back. So it's been interesting to see people. I've talked more about that book in the last year than the last decade before it. So that I think would be my favorite that's out. I really am, and I know people say this, I feel like I'm on like Letterman or something, like hyping the new movie, but I really am excited about this new project I'm doing on John Doerr and the Justice Department, just because the archive has been amazing. I mean, it's 250 bankers boxes of rich, detailed material, and it's just every day I was in the archives, and I spent about a year and a half in there. Every day was just some new discovery. And it really, it got me excited like nothing had got me excited in a long time. And I'm really, right now I'm kind of sorting my way through it, and it'll be a while, I think, with the coronavirus before I get this book out. But I'm really excited to kind of share these findings with people. So in a couple of years, I'll say that, but for now, I'll say White Flight. My eldest child is my favorite.
Okay. Do you mind talking a little bit about kind of your new project too? Because I'll share something is that Kevin came down to Virginia Tech and gave a talk, and I was there in the room where he was kind of talking about his new project, and the students were just kind of leaning in as he was talking about it, like because they were just like getting so enraptured as he was showing. So do you mind just kind of telling us a little bit about this new project?
Do I mind talking about my own work? No, I'm at a story.
Yes.
Yeah, so this new project, it's called, I'm calling it The Division, John Doerr, the Justice Department, and the Civil Rights Movement. And John Doerr was basically the point man for the federal government for the Civil Rights Movement. He was the first assistant in the Civil Rights Division, later wound up heading it in the Johnson years. But through Kennedy and Johnson, he's basically as Obama said when he gave him the Medal of Freedom in 2014, he was basically the face of the civil rights movement, the face of the federal government to the civil rights movement, the face of the civil rights movement to the federal government. And he is present at so many major events. When I describe this to friends who aren't historians, I describe it as Forrest Gump or Zelig. I mean, he's at the freedom rides in Montgomery when John Lewis is getting beaten. He spends the night with James Meredith at Ole Miss when they integrate that. But stand in the schoolhouse door with George Wallace, he's there. The Selma to Montgomery march, he's a mile ahead of them in a car, kind of clearing the way. He helps draft the Voting Rights Act and implement it. He prosecutes Mississippi burning, that trial. He prosecutes that case. He prosecutes the killers of Viola Liuzzo. He pioneers all these voting rights cases across the South. He's this kind of amazing figure who's everywhere across the civil rights movement. And yet, because he didn't really seek out fame, he's not really prominent in the civil rights literature. Civil rights historians know the name, but he's not, I think, as big as I think he should be. And so with this project, I want to do a couple things. One, I think his papers are amazing, and they're going to give a lot of incredibly new revelations about civil rights events we think we knew. So the integration of Ole Miss is one that I think is going to, the stuff I found is going to blow people's minds. He's got in his papers FBI interviews with just about every single person who was in Oxford, Mississippi that day. Students, faculty, administrators, local cops, feds, on and on. And it's just a level of rich detail that describes the riot and the events around it. There was a plot to assassinate James Meredith that apparently was hatched by the Mississippi State Highway Patrol.
Really?
Yeah, it only gets called off. It's called off when the governor basically says, this would be bad for us. Don't do this. And so the level of detail I found is really remarkable, and it's that across the board. And so I'm really excited about that. But also I think it's going to let me offer a slight reconceptualization of the way in which we consider the civil rights struggle. Right now, the literature in its simplest form is really torn between a kind of top-down model that stresses Washington, D.C., kind of the LBJ and JFK, the Supreme Court, Congress, maybe national civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King, and a grassroots approach that really stresses the role of activism at the local level. And both of these approaches are really important, have highlighted different aspects, but they're kind of set apart and against each other. And what John Doerr let me do will be to really tie these two together and to show the way in which the federal government, certain agents of it, linked these movements at the grassroots with these institutions at the federal level. It's also going to let me, I think, talk about the partisan realignment of the 1960s, something I talk about on Twitter a lot, and in interesting ways, because John Doerr was a Republican. He was a Wisconsin Republican. He was a self-styled Lincoln Republican, and he liked to always characterize himself as that. And yet he's working for Democratic administrations in D.C. against Democrats in the South. I mean, he's literally bringing lawsuits against local Democratic officials and committees in Alabama and Mississippi, and forcing them to kind of open the political process up to African Americans. So he's going to let me think about the way in which the 60s and the civil rights struggle really was a war within the Democratic Party, because he's this Republican who's kind of apart from it, but he's deeply entrenched in that process. So for all these reasons, I'm really excited about this project. I'm still in the final stages of research. I was supposed to be at the JFK Library last month. Obviously didn't get to go. But I've done a lot of work on this, and I'm hoping to wrap it up and then get to writing pretty soon.
Yeah.
Nice.
Well,
yeah. I mean, my favorite thing is being in the archives.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just saying, my favorite
absolutely.
thing is being in the archives.
Yeah,
it's the best.
And I mean, I can't imagine anybody being particularly interested in kind of police and state violence and civil rights movements and, African American, like, why would anybody care about that now?
Why would anybody care? It's not an exciting topic at all. No,
it's not relevant. Like, who cares, right? Like, so.
But seriously, one of the things I want to do with this is, and I've talked to Doerr's sons about this too, and they've kind of echoed this too, is that one of the important things about his story is to show the institutions of government actually matter, right? And the people who staff them matter too. And so I think we often have an assumption that kind of the government is this deep state or unchanging mass that's just kind of there, but it really does depend on who's at the wheel, and how those tools of government are used to either to help Americans or to hurt Americans.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, follow-up question, now that you've talked about your research, what's like the one book you think every grad student or not grad student, layperson, regardless of field, that they need to read, right? Thinking about having your foot in the present and stuff.
Well, I mean, if we're talking about the present, the book I would recommend right now would be my friend Tom Segru's book, The Origins of the Urban Crisis, which is really a study that looked at basically the roots of what was at the time one of the biggest riots in American history, the uprising in Detroit in 1967. And Tom does a phenomenal job there of really showing 2 decades of both economic and political and civil rights struggle in the city of Detroit, and people who thought this riot had just kind of come out of nowhere, to really show the way in which institutionalized racism and structural inequality had really led to that point. And so I think it's a great book of kind of a strong explanatory power.
Totally.
That's fantastic. Unfortunately, we're just about out of time, and I don't want to keep Kevin or Varsha, for that matter. So let me just first of all thank you, Kevin, for joining us here on our first Drinking with Historians. As you can see, it's over there. There it is.
Over there.
It's right there. On my virtual background on Zoom. Please, pardon? Yes. So thank you so much for joining us. Yes, it's my virtual background, and I have the screen not reversed, so I have to remember. Anyway, so please join us next week. Our guest will be Dr. Jamie Goodall, who will be talking about pirates in the Chesapeake Bay, who has a fantastic new book out, and we'll continue from there. And also remember to follow both myself, but of course, more interestingly, Kevin and Varsha, who will talk about more interesting things than the Middle Ages, like I do. It's been a wonderful talk. I hope everybody's been able to have a kind of a drink and wind down from the week, and just kind of at least collectively enjoy the company of our fellow historians. You know, although the current pandemic is keeping us apart, this Zoom allows us to do these interesting things, which maybe we haven't been able to do before. So we'll be able to continue. And so thank you again, Kevin, and thank you again, Varsha, and thank you from everyone with our new experiment with this thing called Drinking with Historians. We'll post this video on YouTube afterwards, and other than that, I guess enjoy your last drink, and cheers, everyone.
Yeah. Cheers.
Thanks for having me. Thanks
Cheers.
everyone for watching. Take care.
Yeah, it was
Thanks.
great. Bye. Woo.